Maria stared at the empty armchair in the corner. It was a fixed point in her living room, a monument to the morning her father walked out the front door 12 years ago. He had left behind a half-finished cup of coffee and a silence that never left the house. That silence became her shadow. It followed her to every new job, forcing her to quit whenever a colleague got too close. It sat with her on every date, driving her to check the door every time a car pulled into the driveway. She was always waiting for the departure that had already happened. At 9 years old, she had learned that people vanish, so she perfected the art of leaving first. She sat on the kitchen floor at 2 in the morning, tracing the cracks in the tiles, waiting for a closure that refused to arrive. The house was cold, and every floorboard creak sounded like a footstep heading for the exit. She pushed the armchair into the corner, but the space it occupied remained the center of her gravity. She was a woman living in the wreckage of a single morning, trapped in a cycle of preemptive goodbyes that kept the world at a safe, unreachable distance. The office was quiet, smelling of stale paper and floor wax. Maria sat in the center of a beige room, staring at her own hands. She tried to explain the weight in her chest, but the words felt clumsy. She described it not as a feeling, but as a physical stone, jagged and heavy, that she had carried through every room for 12 years. It was a knot of resentment that tightened every time someone asked her a question about her past. She gripped the arms of the chair until her knuckles turned white. The therapist sat motionless, watching the way Maria avoided eye contact, then leaned forward across the desk. The silence in the room stretched until it felt thin enough to break. The therapist spoke, voice steady and devoid of judgment. Forgiveness is not an invitation for him to return. It is a decision to stop letting his absence dictate your presence. Maria stopped breathing for a second. The words landed like a physical blow, grounding her in the chair. The stone in her chest did not vanish, but for the first time, it felt like something she could set down. She looked up, the air in the room suddenly easier to pull into her lungs. Maria drove through the rain, the tires humming against the asphalt. She entered her home, bypassed the armchair, and went straight to the mahogany desk. She pulled out a stack of yellowed paper, the edges brittle from long storage. She uncapped a pen and pressed the nib into the fiber. Her first stroke was jagged. She began to list every birthday he missed, every holiday that felt hollow, and every night she spent staring at the ceiling in the dark. She did not write to him. She wrote to the girl who was still 9, the one waiting by the door. The pen moved across the page in short, sharp bursts. She cataloged the years of silence. She mapped the geography of her own resentment. Her hand cramped, knuckles locking, but she forced the pen to keep pace with the rush of memories. She filled page after page until the desk was covered in ink-stained evidence of her exhaustion. She was no longer looking for closure. She was exorcising the ghost. The room grew dim, but she did not reach for the light. She kept writing, pouring every ounce of her bottled anger onto the yellow sheets, until the stack was heavy with the weight of a decade. Maria stopped. The pen fell, clattering against the wood. She stood up, her legs stiff from hours of immobility, and gathered the thick stack of paper. Her fingers trembled, not from cold, but from the sudden, sharp reality of the choice. She walked to the fireplace. The grate was cold, filled with gray dust from months ago. She knelt, struck a match, and touched the flame to the corner of the topmost page. It caught instantly. The yellowed paper curled, turning black as the fire ate the ink and the years of recorded pain. She watched the words vanish into smoke. The heat radiated against her face, dry and sharp. She fed the stack into the center of the flames, watching the edges brown and crumble into fine, weightless ash. A sudden, violent shudder went through her frame. The stone in her chest, the one she had carried since she was 9, felt as though it were cracking under the intensity of the heat. She stared until the last corner of paper disappeared, leaving only glowing embers. The silence in the house shifted. The heavy, stagnant pressure that had occupied the air for a decade finally began to break apart and dissolve into the cold evening air. Maria stood up, her joints feeling fluid for the first time in years. She did not look back at the fireplace where the memories had turned to gray dust. She walked toward the front door, her feet making no sound on the floorboards. She reached out, gripped the deadbolt, and twisted it. The lock clicked back with a clean, sharp sound. She pulled the door open. The autumn air rushed in, smelling of damp earth and cooling leaves. It hit her face like a sudden wake-up call. She stepped onto the porch. The world outside was wide and indifferent, and for the first time, she did not mind. She took a long, deep breath, pulling the cold air into her lungs until the tightness in her chest finally dissolved into nothingness. She did not need to call him. She did not need to send a letter. She stood there for a moment, watching the shadows stretch across the grass, then turned around. She pulled the door shut and locked it behind her. She walked down the steps, her stride steady and light. She crossed the yard, heading toward the street, moving toward a future that was entirely her own.